In a quiet Georgia home, a wrestling legend's strength turned into horror. Over one shocking weekend, Chris Benoit, once a hero to millions, killed his wife and son before taking his own life. What drove a disciplined champion to madness? Behind the fame lies a chilling story of rage, trauma, and silence. It began like any other summer weekend in Fayetteville, Georgia, a quiet suburban community where families enjoyed slow, sunny days and the hum of lawnmowers filled the air. But inside a large brick home on Green Meadow Lane, something was unraveling, something that would soon send shockwaves across the world. The name Chris Benoit was about to become synonymous not with wrestling glory, but with one of the darkest tragedies in sports history. Chris Benoit was a 40-year-old professional wrestler, respected by fans and peers alike. Known as the Rabid Wolverine, he was one of the most disciplined and technically skilled athletes in World Wrestling Entertainment, WWE. To the world, he was intense, serious, and deeply committed to his craft. Behind that fierce persona, however, was a man worn down by years of physical punishment, emotional pressure, and a growing storm within his mind. Born in Montreal, Canada, Benoit had chased his dream of wrestling since childhood. He built his career from the ground up, performing in Japan, Canada, and eventually the United States. His reputation was that of a perfectionist, someone who trained harder, fought tougher, and demanded excellence from himself every time he stepped into the ring. His dedication brought him fame, titles, and money, but it also came with hidden costs. Relentless head trauma, painkiller dependency, and mental exhaustion that no one around him fully understood. At home, Benoit lived with his wife, Nancy Benoit, age 43, and their 7-year-old son, Daniel. To outsiders, they were a private family, quiet, reserved, and rarely in the public eye. Nancy was known to wrestling fans as Woman, a former wrestling manager who had worked with several top stars in the 1990s. She had met Chris while managing him during his WCW days, and their on-screen storyline turned into real-life romance. They married in 2000, building a life together that, on the surface, looked like success and stability. But the truth inside their home was different. Friends and neighbors described a relationship strained by arguments, long separations due to wrestling travel schedules, and signs of emotional distance. Those close to Nancy later said she had grown fearful of Chris, his temper, his mood swings, his unpredictable silences. They said she loved him, but worried about what he was becoming. By 2007, Chris Benoit was struggling. The pressures of his career were mounting, and the physical toll of wrestling was visible. He had suffered countless concussions, broken bones, and neck injuries over 2 decades in the ring. WWE's schedule offered little rest, and rumors of steroid use, common in the wrestling world at that time, were widespread. Some colleagues noticed changes in him. He was quieter, withdrawn, and less social than before. Others brushed it off as his usual intensity. But beneath that stoic expression, Chris Benoit was deteriorating mentally and emotionally. In mid-June 2007, WWE was preparing for another pay-per-view event. Benoit was scheduled to compete in a major championship match. To everyone involved, he was still one of their most reliable performers, disciplined, focused, and dependable. But that weekend, all of that would change. On Friday, June 22, 2007, something inside Chris Benoit snapped. Police and investigators later pieced together a timeline of what occurred over the following 3 days, a slow, horrifying sequence that defied explanation. It started late that night inside the Benoit home. At some point, an argument broke out between Chris and Nancy. Whether it was about family issues, his mental state, or something else, no one knows for sure. What is known is that it ended violently. Chris Benoit strangled his wife in their bedroom. When police later found her body, she was wrapped in a towel, her wrists and feet bound. There were bruises on her back, and marks on her neck showed the struggle she put up in her final moments. Investigators determined she died sometime on Friday night, while their young son, Daniel, slept in his room down the hall. After killing his wife, Chris didn't leave the house. He didn't call anyone. He didn't run. He stayed there, surrounded by silence and the aftermath of his actions. For nearly a full day, He moved through the house as if suspended in a daze. He fed the family's dogs. He made strange searches on his computer, looking up information about the prophet Elijah and resurrection stories. He even reached out to a few people, sending vague, confusing text messages that mentioned his home address and his dogs being locked in the enclosed pool area. Those messages didn't make sense at the time, but they would later help police locate the crime scene. The next morning, Saturday, June 23rd, the house remained eerily quiet. At some point that day, Chris went to his son Daniel's room. Daniel was a small, gentle boy who loved cartoons and wrestling. He looked up to his father and often wore tiny replica championship belts around the house. That morning, Chris reportedly gave him a high dose of Xanax, a sedative. The toxicology report later showed the drug in Daniel's system. Once his son was asleep, Chris asphyxiated him. Daniel's body was later found in his bed, still in his pajamas, showing no signs of a struggle. This was not an impulsive act of rage. It was calm, methodical, and horrifyingly deliberate. After killing his wife and son, Chris Benoit remained in the house for nearly another full day. During that time, he continued to send out text messages to friends and colleagues, all carrying subtle hints that something was wrong. Some messages included references to the side doors of the house being open, others to his dogs. None of them mentioned the truth. Meanwhile, WWE management and friends were trying to reach him. Chris was supposed to appear at that weekend's event, but didn't show up. When they couldn't contact him, they grew concerned. It wasn't like Benoit to miss a show or ignore messages. He had built his career on discipline, never breaking commitments. Something fell off, but no one imagined what was really happening. As Sunday, June 24th approached, the situation inside the Benoit home reached its grim end. Chris Benoit went into his personal gym, a room filled with weights, mirrors, and wrestling memorabilia, and prepared to end his life. Using the pulley cable from one of his weight machines, he fashioned a noose and hanged himself. The act was deliberate, quiet, and final. When WWE officials and local police finally arrived at the house the next day, after repeated unanswered calls, they were met with silence. The dogs barked from the yard. Inside, the air was heavy and still. What officers discovered as they moved through the rooms was beyond anything they could have imagined. The lifeless bodies of Nancy and Daniel, and in the gym, Chris Benoit himself. The discovery sent shockwaves through the wrestling world and beyond. In a matter of days, the respected image of a champion had been replaced by the chilling reality of a man who destroyed everything he loved. Fans, colleagues, and journalists all asked the same question. Why? How could someone so disciplined, so admired, commit something so monstrous? The answers would take time to emerge, buried beneath years of pain, secrecy, and the physical toll of a career built on punishment. But as investigators began piecing together the fragments of that weekend, it became clear that this was more than just a murder-suicide. It was the tragic unraveling of a man whose mind and body had finally reached their breaking point. Part 1 ends here in the stillness after discovery, before the world begins to learn the truth about what led to the Benoit family murders, and how a celebrated athlete's internal collapse would change the face of professional wrestling forever. When police officers entered the Benoit residence on the afternoon of June 25, 2007, they were met with an atmosphere so unnervingly quiet that even the sound of footsteps seemed intrusive. The house stood perfectly still, the curtains drawn, the air heavy and stale. The first responders noticed that the front door was unlocked and two large dogs were pacing in the backyard, barking restlessly. As they made their way inside, the scene began to unfold like a nightmare in slow motion. In the living room, nothing appeared out of place. The television was off. A few wrestling trophies and framed photos decorated the shelves, snapshots of a family that, from the outside, seemed happy and united. But upstairs in the master bedroom, the officers found Nancy Benoit lying lifeless on the floor, wrapped in a towel. Her hands and feet were bound, and there were bruises on her back and neck that told a story of struggle and pain. She had been dead for at least 2 days. The officers knew instantly that this was not a burglary or random act. It was personal. They moved down the hallway to another room. There, in a small bed covered with superhero-themed sheets, was 7-year-old Daniel. He looked as if he were asleep, but the truth was much darker. There were no signs of trauma or resistance, just the quiet stillness of a child who had been peacefully sedated and suffocated. Near his bed, officers found an empty Xanax bottle and a Bible placed beside his body. The meaning behind that gesture would be debated for years to come. Finally, they reached the home gym, a place filled with weightlifting equipment, mirrors, and wrestling memorabilia. There they found Chris Benoit. He was hanging from the cable of a weight machine. The officers secured the scene, called the coroner, and began documenting every inch of the house. It was clear this was a triple death investigation, 2 homicides and 1 suicide. But what drove a world-renowned athlete, a devoted father, and husband to do something so unthinkable? Detectives began reconstructing the weekend's timeline. The text messages Benoit sent on Saturday were recovered. Several were sent to his friends and colleagues, including fellow wrestler Chavo Guerrero. The messages were strange. He mentioned that his dogs were locked in the pool area and that the side door of his house was open. Chavo responded, confused, but got no reply. Other wrestlers also received similar texts, but none of them knew what to make of them. At the time, everyone assumed Benoit was dealing with some personal issue. No one could imagine he had already killed his family. The investigation revealed that the killings took place over 3 days. Nancy was killed Friday night, Daniel on Saturday, and Chris himself on Sunday. There was no evidence of an intruder. There were no signs of robbery or forced entry. Everything pointed inward, to the man everyone thought they knew so well. As the news broke, shockwaves rippled through the wrestling community. At first, WWE and fans believed that Benoit, Nancy, and Daniel had been victims of a tragic accident or perhaps a double murder, followed by Chris's suicide under duress. In fact, WWE aired a full tribute show on live television, honoring Benoit's legacy, showing highlights from his career, and featuring emotional interviews from wrestlers who were heartbroken by the loss. But the truth came crashing down only hours later, when police confirmed that Chris Benoit was responsible for both murders before taking his own life. The tribute broadcast was immediately pulled from circulation. WWE issued a statement condemning the actions and cutting all professional ties with Benoit's name. From that point onward, Chris Benoit was erased from WWE history, his name removed from websites, highlight reels, and championship records. For fans who had idolized him, the reality was impossible to accept. Chris Benoit had been known as one of the most disciplined and respectful wrestlers in the business. He trained harder than anyone, rarely drank, and avoided scandal. How could a man so controlled and focused lose all sense of reality? That question became the center of the investigation. Toxicology tests revealed high levels of testosterone in Benoit's system, suggesting recent use of anabolic steroids. This immediately fueled speculation about roid rage, a term describing violent behavior caused by steroid abuse. At the time, steroid use was rampant in professional wrestling, and WWE faced growing scrutiny from media and government officials. But as the investigation went deeper, experts realized that steroids alone couldn't explain the calculated nature of the crimes. The killings were not impulsive, they were deliberate, spread over several days, and carried out with chilling precision. The Fayette County Sheriff's Office, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, all became involved. Authorities searched the house, Benoit's computers, and his medical records. They discovered prescriptions for painkillers, anti-anxiety drugs, and testosterone. They also found records of Benoit's visits to a doctor who had been under investigation for distributing performance-enhancing drugs to athletes. Still, these findings were only part of the puzzle. Something deeper was wrong. Friends and colleagues began speaking out about the changes they had noticed in Benoit during the months leading up to the tragedy. Chavo Guerrero, one of Benoit's closest friends, said he had noticed that Chris seemed distant and paranoid. He told people he was hearing voices and felt someone was watching his family. Others mentioned he seemed exhausted, withdrawn, and uncharacteristically emotional. But no one realized how serious it was. Nancy's family, devastated by the loss, said she had expressed fear about her husband's behavior. She had allegedly told friends she planned to leave him but was worried about how he might react. In 2003, she had even filed a restraining order against him after an argument, claiming he had been physically abusive, though they later reconciled. To those who knew them both, it was clear that their marriage had turned fragile and tense. Meanwhile, WWE was under immense public pressure. The company was forced to defend its practices, its wellness policy, and the grueling schedule that pushed wrestlers to their physical and mental limits. Reporters questioned whether WWE's lifestyle, constant travel, extreme performance expectations, and unchecked use of painkillers had contributed to the tragedy. Company officials quickly denied responsibility, calling the murders a personal, isolated act. But for fans and experts, the story didn't add up so easily. The media coverage intensified. News outlets like CNN, Fox News, and ESPN ran continuous reports about the Benoit case. The words steroids, violence, and wrestling dominated headlines. Some experts speculated that Benoit's long career had caused brain damage from repeated concussions. They recalled other wrestlers who had exhibited strange behavior before their deaths, patterns of depression, memory loss, and emotional instability. That theory gained credibility when months later, doctors at the Sports Legacy Institute conducted an autopsy on Benoit's brain. What they found was staggering. His brain showed severe degeneration, damage consistent with a man in his 80s suffering from advanced Alzheimer's disease. Years of head trauma had left his brain scarred, shrinking, and filled with dead tissue. The condition was known as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, a disease that had only recently been linked to contact sports. Dr. Bennett Omalu and Dr. Julian Bales, who examined Benoit's brain, stated publicly that his condition could have profoundly affected his behavior, impulse control, and emotional stability. The findings shocked the medical community and forced the world of sports to confront an uncomfortable truth. Repeated blows to the head, common in wrestling, football, and boxing, could destroy a person's mind over time. Benoit's brain damage was so severe that it might have left him incapable of rational thought in his final days. As this information surfaced, public opinion began to shift. Some saw Benoit purely as a murderer. Others viewed him as a man destroyed by the industry that made him famous. Both perspectives carried weight, and both reflected the tragedy's complexity. While investigators closed the criminal case, the aftermath rippled through wrestling for years. WWE immediately distanced itself from the tragedy. They stopped mentioning Benoit's name in broadcasts and removed his matches from official releases. Wrestlers were told never to discuss him publicly. The company also revamped its wellness policy, introducing stricter drug testing and concussion protocols. But for those who knew him, none of that could undo what had been done. Chris Benoit had been admired for his precision, his intensity, and his loyalty to his craft. Yet behind the glory was a man slowly losing control, his mind eroding from years of physical trauma, his emotions fractured by stress and painkillers. The murders were the horrifying result of that unseen destruction. The second part of this story closes as investigators finish their work and the world tries to make sense of the unimaginable. In the coming months, the truth about Benoit's mental state, his private struggles, and the decisions that led to that June weekend would emerge piece by piece. The final part would reveal not only the official conclusions of the case, his confession, the verdicts, and the legacy left behind, but also the lasting impact on wrestling, on families, and on the understanding of what brain injury can do to even the strongest among us. As the weeks following the Benoit family tragedy unfolded, the shock did not fade, it deepened. Every new detail painted a more disturbing portrait of what had been happening behind closed doors. Police had finished their investigation, ruling the deaths a double homicide followed by suicide. The official report confirmed what many already feared. Chris Benoit alone was responsible for the deaths of his wife Nancy and son Daniel before taking his own life. But the question of why remained far more complicated than any case file could capture. In the aftermath, Both law enforcement and medical examiners worked to piece together the state of mind that led to Benoit's breakdown. Toxicology reports revealed that Benoit had significant amounts of testosterone in his system, indicating that he was undergoing steroid therapy at the time of the killings. Investigators also found traces of Xanax and hydrocodone, drugs commonly used to treat anxiety and pain. Nancy had alcohol in her blood, though not enough to indicate intoxication. Daniel, meanwhile, had been heavily sedated with Xanax before being asphyxiated. The forensic evidence was clear and methodical. There were no signs of a struggle in the boys' room, reinforcing the conclusion that he never woke up. But evidence alone couldn't explain motive. To understand what had driven one of the most disciplined wrestlers in the world to commit such horror, investigators turned to the deeper story: his history of injuries, his mental health, and his state of mind in the months leading up to June 2007. The timeline revealed that Benoit's decline had been gradual. Friends and colleagues described changes that were subtle at first: mood swings, increasing paranoia, periods of withdrawal, and bursts of anger that quickly gave way to silence. Chavo Guerrero, one of his closest friends, recalled that in their last phone conversation, Benoit sounded disturbed. He mentioned that Nancy and Daniel were not feeling well, his voice trembling and distant. Chavo later said that something about that call felt wrong, almost as if Chris were already gone, speaking from somewhere far away. Family members of Nancy Benoit spoke out publicly, expressing heartbreak but also anger. Her sister Sandra Toffoloni became an outspoken voice demanding accountability, not just from Chris, but from the wrestling industry that, in her words, helped destroy him. She argued that the company's relentless schedule, lack of mental health oversight, and culture of painkiller use had all contributed to her sister's death. "He wasn't a monster from a start," she said in an interview. "They built him into one, piece by piece." As media attention intensified, WWE faced its greatest public relations crisis. The company was accused of promoting unsafe practices and turning a blind eye to drug abuse and concussions. In response, WWE CEO Vince McMahon called a press conference, emphasizing that Benoit's actions were an individual tragedy and not representative of the company's culture. But few were convinced. Critics, former wrestlers, and medical professionals demanded reform, citing the growing list of performers who had died young from drug overdoses, suicides, or mysterious health complications. Then came the defining moment of the case: the results from the brain study conducted by the Sports Legacy Institute. Dr. Bennett Amalu and Dr. Julian Bales released their findings to the public. Chris Benoit's brain showed severe, irreversible damage from repeated concussions and trauma. The results were shocking. His brain tissue displayed lesions and degeneration equivalent to that of an elderly man with late-stage dementia. It was the first major evidence that professional wrestlers, like football players and boxers, were at risk of developing chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. The revelation changed the direction of the discussion entirely. Suddenly, the focus shifted from simple blame to scientific understanding. Was Chris Benoit fully aware of his actions? Did his damaged brain strip away his ability to reason, to control impulse, or to distinguish between reality and delusion? The medical team couldn't provide definitive answers, but the data suggested that his judgment had been profoundly impaired. For the wrestling world, this became a turning point. Wrestlers began coming forward, sharing stories of concussions, blackouts, and memory loss that had been ignored or dismissed for years. Benoit's case forced WWE and other wrestling organizations to implement new policies, banning unprotected chair shots to the head, introducing mandatory concussion testing, and enforcing a stricter drug and wellness program. The tragedy had rewritten the rules of the sport, but at a devastating cost. As the months passed, the families of both Chris and Nancy tried to come to terms with what had happened. They arranged separate funerals, held in Canada and Florida. Benoit was buried quietly beside his parents in Alberta, his grave unmarked to prevent vandalism. Nancy and Daniel were laid to rest together in Florida, surrounded by grieving relatives and friends. WWE sent no representatives to either service. The fallout from the murders went beyond personal grief. Benoit's name became a taboo subject in the wrestling community. Within days, WWE scrubbed all references to him from their website, video archives, and promotional materials. His championships were erased from official history. Episodes featuring him were removed from streaming platforms. For years, the company refused to speak his name publicly. He became a ghost, once a celebrated champion, now a symbol of shame and destruction. Meanwhile, law enforcement concluded its investigation. There would be no trial, no confession, no sentencing. The case was closed as a murder-suicide, leaving the public to debate motive and meaning. Yet unofficially, the confession came through the details Chris left behind. His final acts that weekend. The text messages, the placement of Bibles next to the bodies, and the orderly way he carried out each act suggested that he believed he was protecting his family from something, though what that was remains unknown. Investigators found no written note, no video, no explanation. Only silence. In the years that followed, documentaries, books, and interviews attempted to piece together what went wrong. Some focused on Benoit's mental collapse, others on the industry that enabled it. His former colleagues wrestled with conflicting emotions, grief for the man they knew and disgust for what he had done. Many said they could never watch his matches again, even though his in-ring ability had once been considered among the greatest of all time. The Benoit case also reignited debates about the culture of masculinity in professional wrestling, the expectation that wrestlers suppress pain, ignore injuries, and perform through suffering. Former wrestlers revealed that concussions were often treated with painkillers and a quick return to the ring. If you were hurt, one wrestler said, you just work through it. That's what Chris did. That's what we all did. Years later, when the true crime documentary Dark Side of the Ring revisited the story, the emotional weight was still raw. Chris's surviving son from a previous relationship, David Benoit, appeared in the episode, speaking publicly for the first time. He described his father as loving but broken, a man who could not separate his wrestling persona from his real life. I still love him, he said quietly, but I'll never understand what he did. His words echoed the feelings of countless fans who had once idolized Chris Benoit, the disbelief, the sorrow, and the lingering confusion that never quite faded. Over time, the tragedy evolved into something larger than one man's downfall. It became a warning about the hidden costs of fame and physical sacrifice. It exposed the long-term dangers of untreated brain injuries and opened conversations that extended far beyond wrestling, to football, hockey, boxing, and mixed martial arts. In that sense, the Benoit case forced an entire industry to confront its negligence. Yet, despite the policy changes and public discussions, the emotional scar remained. Those who had known Nancy and Daniel still spoke of them with warmth and sorrow. Two innocent lives lost to forces they could neither see nor control. Nancy's sister Sandra dedicated her life to raising awareness about CTE and domestic abuse, turning tragedy into advocacy. She often said that her goal was to make sure no other family had to endure what hers did. By the 10th anniversary of the murders, Benoit's name had faded from wrestling commentary, but not from memory. His matches, though technically brilliant, remained locked away, unmentioned and uncelebrated. The WWE Hall of Fame would never include him, and his records remained erased. In public eyes, his legacy was divided, part champion, part killer, part victim of his own deteriorating mind. The story of Chris Benoit, the wrestler, the husband, the father, ends not with redemption or resolution, but with a haunting lesson. It reveals how unchecked trauma, silence, and neglect can twist greatness into tragedy. It shows how the same discipline that once built a champion could, under the weight of pain and confusion, destroy everything around him. In the end, what happened in that Fayetteville home in June 2007 was more than a crime. It was a collapse of a man under invisible pressure, a warning of what happens when strength becomes isolation, and when the body and mind finally give out after years of damage. The Benoit family murders remain one of the most shocking and heartbreaking cases in modern sports history, a dark reminder that behind every hero's smile, there may be a battle no one else can see. And though the world has moved on, the echoes of that weekend still linger, whispering the same unanswered question. How did it come to this? A quiet home, a former wrestling star, and a horrifying secret unraveled one February morning in 2024. When police broke through the door, what they found shocked Portland, Oregon. Behind the fame and glory lay a dark descent into madness. But what truly drove Billy Jack Haynes to kill? Portland, Oregon. A quiet February morning in 2024. The streets were calm, the air still, and nothing suggested the tragedy that was about to unfold inside a small, single-story home in the Lents neighborhood. Behind that house's front door lived a man once known to thousands, a name that had echoed across wrestling arenas in the 1980s. Billy Jack Haynes. Once a national wrestling star, now a 70-year-old retiree living with his 85-year-old wife, Jeanette Beecraft. To most of their neighbors, they seemed like an aging couple trying to live out their later years in peace. But what happened that day would forever stain the image of the man who once stood under bright lights, cheered by roaring crowds. Billy Jack Haynes, born in Portland, had built a reputation as a powerful and intense competitor in the wrestling world. He wasn't just another performer. He was known for his raw energy, his temper, and his authenticity inside the ring. His signature strength move, the full Nelson, made him a favorite in matches where emotion ran high and every punch was thrown with conviction. But when the lights faded, the cheers ended, and the years caught up to him, Billy's life began to shift. The physical injuries, years of painkillers, and the slow erosion of fame took their toll. Friends from his wrestling days often said he struggled to let go of that identity, the fame, the adrenaline, the feeling of being someone. For decades, Jeanette had been by his side, a quiet, kind woman who loved gardening and keeping to herself. Neighbors described her as gentle and patient, the sort of person who smiled at everyone. She'd lived through her share of life's hardships, and, at her age, she seemed to want nothing more than peace in her final years. Billy, however, was not the same. Those close to the couple recalled that as he got older, his behavior changed. He was seen yelling at himself outside, pacing the yard, muttering things no one could quite understand. Some believed it was memory loss. Others thought the years of pain, injuries, and possible substance dependence had begun to blur his sense of reality. In the months leading up to February 2024, police had reportedly been called to the house at least once over noise and domestic arguments. Nothing major came of those visits, no charges, no arrests, but it was enough to make some neighbors uneasy. They heard shouting, the sound of things being thrown, and sometimes even muffled cries. But each time, it seemed to calm down. Jeanette would appear in her garden a few days later, smiling politely, as if nothing had happened. Then came February 8th. Early that morning, a neighbor called 911 reporting what sounded like a gunshot and shouting coming from the Haynes home. The Portland Police Bureau dispatched officers immediately. When they arrived, they found the house locked, blinds drawn, and no response from inside. The air outside was tense. The silence that followed the loud noise only deepened the dread of what they might find. Officers knocked repeatedly, identifying themselves, but there was no answer. Moments later, the situation escalated when they realized that Billy was still inside, alive but refusing to come out. This began what authorities would later describe as a high-risk standoff. The Special Emergency Reaction Team, CERT, was called in. Armored vehicles arrived quietly. Neighbors were told to stay indoors. Roads were blocked off as police negotiators tried to make contact with Billy. He was reportedly speaking incoherently through the door, at times calm, at times shouting. Negotiators spent hours trying to de-escalate the situation, aware that inside the house, there might already be a body. As the hours stretched on, the tone grew more urgent. Around midday, after several attempts at communication, police finally managed to make entry. Inside, they discovered the lifeless body of 85-year-old Jeanette Beecraft. She had been shot once, the wound fatal. The sight was heartbreaking. A frail woman who had likely trusted the man standing over her more than anyone else in the world. The home, police said later, showed signs of struggle. Items were overturned, and a firearm was found nearby. Billy was taken into custody without further violence. Officers reported that he appeared disoriented and physically weak. He was immediately transported to a nearby hospital for a medical check before being moved to Multnomah County Jail. The arrest shocked not just the local community, but the world of professional wrestling. Fans who remembered the strong, charismatic performer from decades earlier now saw his face on news channels for the worst possible reason: second-degree murder. As the story broke, headlines around the country carried his name. Former WWF star arrested for killing wife, read one. From the ring to a jail cell, said another. The narrative quickly became one of tragedy. A man who once embodied physical power, now reduced to an accused killer in old age. In the days that followed, investigators began piecing together what had led to the fatal shooting. Friends and relatives were interviewed. Some said Billy had grown increasingly paranoid. One neighbor recounted that he believed people were spying on him and that he often accused Jeanette of plotting against him, claims no one could verify. Others spoke of his physical and mental decline. He was said to be battling health issues, including memory loss and possible dementia. The police, however, remained cautious, saying only that the motive was still under investigation. The story hit an emotional chord across the nation. Many couldn't help but reflect on how someone once cheered as a hero could fall so far. The tragedy wasn't just the act of violence itself, but what it revealed: the fragile line between fame and obscurity, strength and vulnerability. For years, Billy had been a symbol of physical endurance, a fighter. But behind closed doors, it appeared he was fighting a different kind of battle, one that he could not win. Meanwhile, Jeanette's friends described her as a woman of quiet strength. She had been a caregiver most of her life, not just to family, but to Billy as well. They said she stayed with him out of loyalty, even as his temper worsened and his confusion deepened. She was always patient with him, one neighbor said in an interview. She loved him, even when he wasn't easy to love. Authorities ruled the death a homicide, and the charge, murder in the second degree, meant prosecutors believed it wasn't premeditated but intentional. The community of Lentz, normally peaceful, became the center of national attention for days. Police maintained a steady presence around the property, while reporters gathered outside hoping for details. As more facts came to light, it became clear that this was not a story of a cold-blooded criminal, but of a man who had lost control of his mind, his emotions, and his life. The investigation continued, but to many, the heartbreaking image remained the same: an aging former wrestling icon sitting in handcuffs, his career and his freedom both gone, and the woman who once stood by him now dead in their home. Part 1 of the story ends with questions still unanswered. What exactly happened inside that house before the gun went off? What led a man once cheered as a hero to become the focus of a homicide investigation? And most of all, could this tragedy have been prevented if someone had seen the warning signs sooner? The answers would slowly come to light in the days that followed, as the police and the public began to uncover the darker side of Billy Jack Haynes' final years. In the days following the discovery of Jeanette Beecraft's body, the house on Southeast 100th Avenue in Portland transformed from a quiet home into a sealed crime scene. Yellow police tape surrounded the small property, the once peaceful neighborhood now crowded with media vans, curious neighbors, and crime scene investigators moving in and out with bags of evidence. Every movement was recorded, every detail documented. The police wanted to understand how a domestic dispute between an elderly couple had turned into a fatal shooting. The world wanted to know how Billy Jack Haynes, a man who once commanded audiences in arenas, ended up accused of murdering the woman he had lived with for decades. Detectives from the Portland Police Bureau's Homicide Unit began their investigation immediately. They collected fingerprints, studied the trajectory of the bullet, and examined the weapon found near Jeanette's body, a small-caliber handgun registered to Billy himself. The condition of the room told a story of chaos. Furniture slightly displaced, papers scattered on a table, a broken picture frame on the floor. It was not a scene of premeditated violence, but rather of a sudden explosion of anger. Investigators noted that Jeanette had not been shot multiple times, just once, and there were no signs that Billy had attempted to flee. Instead, he stayed inside, barricaded and unresponsive until the police arrived. That detail alone raised questions about his mental state at the time of the shooting. Neighbors described hearing a heated argument that morning. One woman said she heard shouting, Billy's voice, though she couldn't make out the words. Another reported hearing a single loud bang, followed by silence. Moments later, she saw police cars flooding the street. To them, it seemed unthinkable that the fragile man they saw shuffling down the driveway days before was capable of such violence. But the evidence, grim as it was, pointed only one way. As the investigation deepened, detectives began to dig into Billy's background. What they found was a pattern of decline, physically, mentally, and emotionally. After retiring from professional wrestling in the late 1990s, Billy struggled with chronic pain and depression. Years of physical punishment in the ring had left his body scarred and weakened. Like many wrestlers of his generation, he had relied heavily on painkillers and steroids during his career, substances that often carried long-term consequences. By his mid-60s, his physical health was deteriorating rapidly. His knees were damaged, his back was barely functional, and he was said to be on multiple prescription medications. Friends from the wrestling circuit recalled that he had grown increasingly paranoid, often claiming that people were following him or that his phone was being tapped. Some said he believed the government was watching him. It was unclear how much of this paranoia was fueled by medication or mental illness, but everyone agreed on one thing. Billy was no longer the man they remembered from a ring. His wife, Jeanette, had stood by him through it all. She was described as gentle, understanding, and endlessly patient. She did her best to manage the household and care for Billy, even when his outbursts frightened her. A neighbor once mentioned seeing her outside after a particularly loud argument. She had brushed off concerns, saying Billy was just having a bad day. But those bad days were becoming more frequent. The detectives also discovered that Billy had made several posts online in the months before the incident, some of them rambling, others angry. He spoke about government conspiracies, corruption in professional wrestling, and feeling betrayed by those he once trusted. While not directly threatening, the tone reflected a man detached from reality. Friends who visited the couple occasionally noted that Jeanette seemed tired and cautious, always trying to keep Billy calm, as though walking on eggshells around him. When police questioned Billy after his arrest, his statements were inconsistent. At times, he claimed not to remember what happened. At other times, he spoke in fragments about protecting himself and needing to end the pain. Detectives realized they were dealing with someone who might not fully grasp the seriousness of his actions. After several interviews, a clear motive still hadn't surfaced. The authorities ruled the death as a domestic homicide, but whether it stemmed from an argument, confusion, or a deeper mental break remained uncertain. Meanwhile, news outlets across the country picked up the story. For younger generations, Billy's name meant little. But to wrestling fans of the 1980s, the name Billy Jack Haynes stirred memories of a time when wrestling was raw, larger than life, and unapologetically dramatic. Clips of his old matches began circulating online. His powerful physique, his shouting promos, his intense energy in the ring. And next to those old highlights were the new headlines: former wrestling star charged with wife's murder. Public reaction was a mix of disbelief and sorrow. Some fans expressed sympathy, suggesting that years of head injuries and trauma might have affected his mind. Others condemned him outright, arguing that no level of mental decline could justify taking another life, especially that of a devoted spouse. Back in Portland, prosecutors were preparing charges. They formally accused Billy of murder in the second degree and unlawful use of a weapon. The second-degree charge suggested that prosecutors believed the act was intentional but not pre-planned. It fit the picture detectives were painting: an argument turned deadly, a flash of rage from a man who no longer had control over his emotions. The district attorney's office confirmed that they were also requesting a full psychiatric evaluation. This was standard in cases involving elderly defendants, but in Billy's situation, it was particularly important. His erratic statements, coupled with his known medical conditions, made it possible that he was suffering from cognitive decline. Until that evaluation was complete, he remained under close supervision at the Multnomah County Detention Center, placed in a medical observation unit due to his age and health problems. As weeks passed, more pieces of the couple's life emerged. Jeanette had been described by everyone who knew her as gentle, loyal, and private. She rarely talked about her marriage, even to friends. She spent much of her time reading, gardening, or caring for her husband. Her family members said that she had expressed concern about Billy's mental state but refused to leave him. She often said, "He's sick, not evil." It was a heartbreaking statement that, in hindsight, felt like a quiet warning. While Billy waited for the legal process to unfold, public interest in the story grew. True crime podcasts began dissecting the case, focusing on the blurred line between aging, illness, and accountability. Some compared his story to other former athletes who had suffered from brain trauma and psychological deterioration after years of physical punishment. But even among those sympathetic to his struggles, no one could escape the simple truth. An 85-year-old woman had lost her life at the hands of the man she trusted most. Inside the police department, detectives were still trying to build a full timeline of that morning. They believed the argument began around 9:30 a.m. and escalated quickly. Jeanette may have tried to calm him down or walk away, but the situation spiraled. The single gunshot that ended her life likely came from close range. Investigators found no evidence of a struggle that lasted long, just one moment of irreversible violence. When the official autopsy report came back, it confirmed what they already knew. Jeanette died instantly from a gunshot wound to the chest. There were no defensive wounds on her hands, no signs that she had fought back. That fact alone broke the hearts of many who followed the case. It seemed she hadn't even had the chance to protect herself. For the investigators, the motive remained a puzzle. There was no sign of financial trouble, no clear plan, no message or note left behind. This wasn't about money or betrayal. It was something more internal, more tragic. It was about the collapse of a man's mind and the unbearable cost that came with it. By early March, Billy had made his first court appearance. Frail and disoriented, he shuffled into the courtroom in a yellow jail jumpsuit, his hands trembling. The judge read out the charges as he stood silently, staring at the floor. Reporters filled the benches, capturing every detail. Outside, fans who once cheered his name now whispered about the fall of a hero. The judge ordered further psychological testing before the case could move forward. Billy was sent back to custody, awaiting the results that would determine whether he was competent to stand trial. For many, it seemed that the man sitting in that courtroom was not the same Billy Jack Haynes who once flexed his muscles in front of a roaring crowd. The years, the pain, and perhaps his own mind had taken everything from him, his career, his health, and now his freedom. As part 2 of this story closes, the investigation had painted a haunting picture of decline and despair. The wrestling legend, who once symbolized strength and determination, was now the focus of a case that blurred the boundaries between guilt and tragedy. The truth and Billy's own confession were yet to come. Those answers would finally surface as the courtroom drama began to unfold in the final part of the story. By late spring of 2024, the case of Billy Jack Haynes had become one of the most talked about true crime stories in Oregon. News channels, tabloids, and sports outlets all followed the same haunting headline: former wrestling star charged with killing his wife. The small Portland courtroom where his hearings were held was packed each time he appeared. For those who once watched him slam opponents in the ring, it was difficult to recognize the man sitting quietly at the defense table, his body frail, his expression vacant. Gone was the booming voice, the proud stance, the flash of confidence. What remained was an elderly man weighed down by confusion, regret, and the crushing reality of what he had done. The psychological evaluation ordered by the judge revealed what many had already suspected. The report, later presented in court, described Billy as suffering from early-stage dementia, depression, and significant cognitive impairment likely linked to years of head trauma and substance abuse. The doctors noted that while he understood basic facts about his case, his ability to reason or recall events clearly was severely compromised. However, The court found him competent to stand trial, meaning he could still be held legally responsible for his actions. It was a delicate decision, one that balanced compassion for his condition with justice for the life that had been taken. The prosecution began laying out its case in the following weeks. Their argument was straightforward. Billy intentionally shot his wife, Jeanette Beecraft, during a domestic argument that escalated beyond control. They presented the forensic evidence, the recovered handgun, the bullet trajectory, and the absence of any sign of forced entry. They also played portions of the 911 calls from neighbors, capturing the panic and confusion in those tense minutes before the police arrived. The prosecutor emphasized that Jeanette had no means to defend herself, no history of violence, and no reason to provoke such a deadly attack. The defense, led by a public defender with experience in mental health cases, took a different route. They didn't deny that Billy had pulled the trigger. Instead, they argued that he was not in full control of his actions. The defense painted a picture of a man who had been deteriorating for years, struggling with brain damage from repeated concussions and a long list of physical and psychological ailments. They called attention to his history in professional wrestling, the constant blows to the head, the physical punishment endured over 2 decades in the ring, and how those years may have shaped his mental decline. Witnesses were called from both sides. Neighbors testified about the couple's frequent arguments, but also about Jeanette's devotion to her husband. One woman, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, told the court that Jeanette had once confided in her, saying Billy sometimes grew paranoid and accused her of betrayal. She said she was scared some nights, the neighbor recalled softly, but she still said she couldn't leave him. She thought he needed her. Another neighbor described hearing Billy's voice shouting on the morning of the shooting, something about ending it, before the single gunshot echoed through the street. When it came time for Billy to speak, the courtroom fell silent. His voice was low and uneven. He said he didn't remember the exact moment of the shooting, but accepted that he had done it. He spoke of confusion, pain, and fear. Fear of losing his mind, fear of being a burden to his wife, fear that he was becoming someone she no longer recognized. His brief statement ended with a tremor in his voice. I loved her more than anyone. I don't know why it happened. I just know I can't take it back. It was the closest thing to a confession the court would receive. No dramatic outburst, no lengthy explanation, just a broken man acknowledging an irreversible act. For the prosecutors, it was enough. They argued that even if Billy was confused, he still chose to pick up the gun, aim it, and pull the trigger. Intent, they said, did not require clarity. It only required action. Throughout the proceedings, Jeanette's family sat quietly in the front row, listening to every word. Her niece later spoke to reporters, describing Jeanette as a woman who gave everything she had to help him, and it cost her life. The statement resonated deeply, reminding everyone that behind the headlines and courtroom arguments was a real victim, a gentle, elderly woman who had lived her final years in fear, but never gave up on the man she loved. The trial lasted several weeks. Each testimony and expert opinion built a picture of tragedy rather than malice, a slow descent into mental collapse that ended with a fatal mistake. In closing arguments, the prosecutor called it a preventable tragedy, emphasizing that Billy could have sought help long before things turned deadly. The defense countered that mental decline was not something he could control, and that prison would serve no purpose for a man whose mind was already fading. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Billy sat motionless, staring ahead, as the verdict was read, guilty of second-degree murder. The decision carried a mandatory prison sentence, though the court took into account his age and deteriorating condition. At sentencing, Billy's attorney requested leniency, arguing that incarceration would be effectively a life sentence for someone of his health and age. The judge, after a long pause, agreed in part. While condemning the act, she acknowledged the complexity of the case, the mental illness, the years of physical damage, and the absence of prior violent convictions. She sentenced him to 10 years in state custody, with eligibility for early medical release depending on his condition. It was a balance between accountability and compassion, but no sentence could undo what had been done. In his final court appearance, Billy thanked the judge quietly and asked to speak one last time. "I wish I could change places with her," he said. "She didn't deserve this. She was my whole life." His voice broke, and for a moment, even those who had condemned him could see the shadow of the man he used to be, the fierce competitor, the proud husband, and now the fallen figure trying to grasp at redemption that would never come. After the sentencing, Billy was transferred to the Oregon State Penitentiary's medical unit, where elderly and ill inmates received treatment under supervision. Reports later suggested that he spent most of his days in silence, rarely interacting with others. He was placed on medications for depression and cognitive decline, often staring blankly at the television as wrestling reruns from decades ago played, echoes of a life that once felt larger than the world. Jeanette was laid to rest in a small ceremony attended by her relatives and a handful of neighbors. There were no crowds, no cameras, just quiet prayers for a woman whose kindness had defined her. Her family requested privacy, saying only that they hoped the case would serve as a reminder of the hidden dangers of untreated mental illness and domestic isolation among the elderly. As time passed, the story faded from the headlines, replaced by newer tragedies and fresher scandals. But for those who remembered, the Billy Jack Haynes case remained a haunting example of how fame, aging, and unchecked mental decline can collide in the most devastating way. Behind the glamour of sports entertainment, behind the cheers and applause, there had always been a man wrestling with pain, both physical and emotional, that no victory could fix. For investigators, it was a case that raised difficult questions about accountability. Could someone like Billy truly understand the consequences of his actions? Should the justice system treat age and illness as mitigating factors in such cases? There were no easy answers, only the sobering realization that tragedy can exist in many forms, sometimes loud and public, sometimes quiet and domestic, hidden behind closed doors until it's too late. In his final recorded statement to prison staff months later, Billy reportedly said, "I don't see the crowd anymore. I just see her face." It was a simple line, but it carried the weight of a man confronting the cost of his downfall. The once celebrated wrestler who had fought countless battles in the ring had lost the most important one, the battle with himself. And so the story of Billy Jack Haynes and Jeanette Beecraft came to an end, not with a roar of an arena crowd but with silence, the silence of a house where love, confusion, and violence had met in their final, tragic collision. It was a reminder that behind even the strongest personas can lie fragile minds, and behind every crime, a web of pain that no victory can ever erase. Las Vegas, a city of lights, secrets, and sudden darkness. When a Halloween party turns deadly, a former wrestler and political hopeful becomes a prime suspect. What really happened that night inside the luxury suite? Was it a father's instinct or uncontrolled rage that ended a man's life? Las Vegas, a city built on lights, luxury, and illusions. But beneath the glittering skyline, the line between glamour and tragedy often blurs in an instant. On the night of October 29, 2023, that line disappeared completely when a Halloween party at a luxury hotel suite turned deadly. At the center of it all was a man once celebrated for his strength and charisma, former professional wrestler and political hopeful Daniel "Danny" Rodimer. The victim was a 47-year-old man named Christopher Tapp, whose life ended in a matter of seconds after a violent altercation that no one in that suite would ever forget. Daniel Rodimer had lived many lives. In his 40s, he was a husband, a father, a businessman, and a man who had once stepped into the wrestling ring under the bright lights of the WWE. His large build, 6'7" frame, and intense energy made him both admired and intimidating. After leaving wrestling, he sought a different kind of spotlight, politics. He ran for Congress in Nevada, campaigning as a conservative figure who promised to fight for the working class. To the public, he was confident, driven, and successful. But behind the scenes, life was not as perfect as it looked on camera. Friends later described Rodimer as someone struggling to balance fame, pressure, and personal life. That late October night, the Rodimer family was attending a private party in Las Vegas, a city that had long been a playground for celebrities and the powerful. The suite was packed with people, friends, associates, and guests, all gathered to celebrate the Halloween weekend. The atmosphere was charged, loud music, drinks flowing, laughter mixed with occasional arguments. Among those present was Christopher Tapp, a man with a complicated past, but a reputation for kindness and calm. Years earlier, he had gained national attention after spending 2 decades in prison for a crime he didn't commit, a wrongful conviction that made him a symbol of endurance and second chances. After his release, Tapp had rebuilt his life, trying to move forward quietly. That night, he had no idea that fate was about to betray him again. As the evening went on, witnesses later told investigators that there was tension in the air. A disagreement began involving Rodimer's stepdaughter, a young woman in her 20s who had also attended the party. The issue, according to multiple accounts, involved drugs, something about who had brought them and who had taken them. Rumors quickly spread through the room that someone had given the young woman a substance without her knowledge. When the story reached Rodimer, his demeanor changed. Those who knew him from his wrestling days said he could switch from calm to explosive in seconds. That night, that switch flipped. Rodimer reportedly stormed into the room where Christopher Tapp was standing, confronting him about the alleged incident. Tapp denied any wrongdoing, insisting he had done nothing inappropriate or illegal. But the tension between the two men escalated fast. Voices were raised. Witnesses said Rodimer shouted at Tapp, demanding answers and calling him names. Some guests tried to step in, but the argument had already spiraled out of control. Then came the moment that would change everything. In a sudden burst of anger, Rodimer reportedly lunged toward Tapp. Witnesses said the former wrestler struck Tapp hard, a single, devastating blow that sent the 47-year-old man crashing to the ground. The room went silent for a moment. Some thought it was a scuffle that would end quickly, but it didn't. When Tapp didn't move, panic set in. Guests rushed to his side. He was bleeding from a head wound, unconscious, and unresponsive. Someone called 911. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, transporting Christopher Tapp to a nearby hospital. For a while, there was hope he might survive, but the damage was too severe. The medical examiner later ruled that Tapp had died from blunt force trauma to the head, the direct result of a violent assault. The tragedy rippled through Las Vegas. What was supposed to be a night of celebration became a crime scene. Detectives began interviewing everyone who had attended the party. Witness accounts painted a disturbing picture. A man whose temper had cost another man his life. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department opened an investigation, gathering evidence, reviewing surveillance footage, and analyzing the timeline of events that led up to the fatal confrontation. Meanwhile, as news of the incident began to spread, people were stunned. Daniel Rodimer, the former WWE wrestler and congressional candidate, was a well-known public figure. To many, it seemed unbelievable that someone with his profile could be connected to a violent crime. His past career, his image as a family man, and his ambitions in politics all stood in sharp contrast to the brutality of the allegations. But behind closed doors, the investigation continued to build momentum. Authorities learned that there had been no weapons involved, only physical force. The attack had been sudden and personal. They also discovered that several guests had seen the confrontation unfold. Some were too afraid to speak at first, fearing public exposure or backlash, but over time, their statements aligned. Rodimer had been angry, he had accused Tapp of something, and in a flash of rage, he had struck him. For months, the case remained under quiet review. The police and the Clark County District Attorney's Office gathered witness testimonies, autopsy results, and evidence to determine whether there was enough to charge Rodimer. Meanwhile, the Rodimer family stayed out of public view. No statements were released, no comments to the media. But behind the scenes, the pressure was mounting. By early 2024, the investigators had their case. In March 2024, after months of silence, a grand jury formally indicted Daniel Rodimer for murder. The news broke quickly, flashing across every major network. Headlines labeled it a shocking twist, former WWE star charged in Las Vegas death. The city that had once embraced him as an entertainer now watched as his name became linked to tragedy. The following week, Rodimer made the decision to turn himself in. He arrived at the Las Vegas jail in a dark suit, flanked by his attorney. Cameras surrounded him as reporters shouted questions he didn't answer. Inside, he was processed, fingerprinted, and booked on a $200,000 bail. His mugshot, the face of a man once larger than life, became the image of a downfall. As he walked out on bail, reporters demanded to know his side of the story. Was it self-defense? Was it a misunderstanding? Rodimer remained silent, eyes down, his expression heavy. His lawyer told the press that he intended to vigorously defend himself, and that this was a tragic accident, not a crime. But the evidence, according to prosecutors, told a different story, one of anger, impulsiveness, and a fatal mistake that ended a life. The death of Christopher Tapp left his family devastated. After years of fighting for justice in his wrongful conviction case, Tapp had finally started to live again. He had been free for only a few years, finally able to enjoy life on his own terms. Now, that life was cut short in a senseless act of violence. His friends and supporters described him as gentle, humble, and grateful for his second chance. Losing him in such a brutal way felt like fate had played its cruelest hand. By the end of March, the case had moved into the legal phase. Prosecutors outlined the charges. The defense began crafting its narrative. The stage was set for what would become one of Las Vegas's most talked about trials of the year, a case that blended celebrity, tragedy, and the harsh consequences of anger. The courtroom lights were bright, but the mood was heavy. When the case of Daniel Rodimer reached the public stage in mid-2024, it became more than a criminal trial. It became a story about control, temper, and the thin line between power and downfall. What had started as a private tragedy inside a Las Vegas hotel suite had grown into a national headline. Cameras waited outside the courthouse every morning. Reporters followed every movement, and the city's gossip fed on speculation. Inside, however, the focus was on one question. Was Christopher Tapp's death a tragic accident or an act of violent rage? From the beginning, the prosecution presented the case as clear-cut manslaughter turned murder. They argued that Rodimer, fueled by anger and ego, had lost control and attacked Tapp without justification. According to their narrative, there was no physical threat, no provocation, only a verbal dispute that spiraled into violence. Prosecutors describe how the Halloween night had started peacefully, with friends and family enjoying drinks, music, and laughter, until Rodimer's stepdaughter became the center of a misunderstanding involving drugs. Witnesses testified that the young woman appeared upset, prompting Rodimer to confront whoever he believed was responsible. That confrontation, they said, led directly to Tapp's fatal injury. To strengthen their argument, the prosecutors called several witnesses who had attended the party. One of them, a longtime friend of the Rodimer family, said that he saw Daniel pacing angrily before the confrontation. He recalled hearing Daniel shout, "Who gave it to her?" before storming into the room where Tapp stood. Another witness, a woman who had been sitting nearby, testified that she heard a loud thud followed by a scream. When she turned, she saw Tapp on the floor and Rodimer standing over him, his fists clenched, his face red with fury. The room went silent, she said, and then people began to panic. Medical experts took the stand next. The Clark County Medical Examiner described the nature of Tapp's injuries in clinical but chilling detail. The blow to his head, he explained, was consistent with a fall following a heavy impact, the kind of force delivered by a strong, trained man. There were no signs of defensive wounds on Tapp's body, suggesting that he hadn't tried to fight back. His death, the examiner confirmed, was caused by blunt force trauma that resulted in internal bleeding and swelling in the brain. The defense, however, painted a different picture. They argued that Rodimer had not intended to kill anyone. Their version of events suggested that he was trying to protect his family, specifically his stepdaughter, after believing that someone had endangered her. They claimed that the confrontation had escalated unexpectedly, and that the single strike that killed Tapp was an accident, not a deliberate act of murder. The defense emphasized that Daniel had no criminal history, no violent record outside of his professional wrestling career, and that he had cooperated fully with authorities. In the defense's narrative, Daniel was a man caught in an emotional storm, a protective father figure who made a terrible mistake in the heat of the moment. His lawyer told the court that Daniel was acting as any father would when he believed his child was in danger. They also pointed out that the incident occurred in a chaotic environment, with alcohol, stress, and confusion clouding everyone's judgment. Throughout the proceedings, Daniel Rodimer sat quietly at the defense table, dressed sharply but looking far from the confident athlete or politician people remembered. His expressions alternated between remorse and exhaustion. When witnesses described the attack, he avoided eye contact. At one point, as photos of Christopher Tapp were shown on the screen, Daniel lowered his head and wiped his face. The public, however, remained divided. Some saw Daniel as a reckless man whose temper cost a life. Others saw him as a human being who made a tragic mistake under emotional pressure. The case became a reflection of modern celebrity culture, how easily a person's public image could crumble under the weight of one irreversible act. In the weeks following the indictment, details about Daniel's life began to resurface. News outlets revisited his wrestling career, showing clips from his time in the WWE, when he went by the name Dan Rodman. He had played the role of the tough guy, the enforcer, the man who could dominate a ring with his size and aggression. It was a persona built on intimidation, and now prosecutors argued that same aggression had reappeared in real life. Then there was his political background. In 2020, he had run for Congress in Nevada's 3rd District, branding himself as a conservative outsider ready to bring strength and leadership to Washington. His campaign ads showed him in cowboy hats, smiling with his family, riding horses, an image of wholesome masculinity. Those clips played on national television again, now juxtaposed with his mugshot. The contrast was striking. Back inside the courtroom, the tension continued to rise. The prosecution revealed that Rodimer had initially tried to downplay the incident when police first contacted him. According to their records, he described the altercation as an accident during a heated argument. However, forensic evidence and witness statements didn't support that claim. Detectives found traces of blood on surfaces inside the suite, matching Tapp's DNA, and a timeline showing that Daniel left the scene shortly after the assault while others called for help. That detail became a key point in the trial. Prosecutors argued it showed consciousness of guilt, while the defense claimed Daniel was in shock. Through all this, one voice carried quiet but undeniable weight, the voice of Christopher Tapp's family. His sister, speaking during the proceedings, described the unbearable pain of losing her brother after he had fought so hard to rebuild his life. He spent 20 years in prison for something he didn't do, she said, her voice trembling. And just when he finally got his life back, someone took it away again. Her words silenced the courtroom. As the trial reached its midpoint, media coverage intensified. True crime programs dissected the timeline, experts debated legal strategies, and social media erupted with opinions. Some fans of Rodimer's wrestling days posted messages of support, claiming he didn't deserve to be treated like a murderer. Others demanded justice for Tapp, calling the incident another example of privilege shielding violence. In the background, investigators continued to piece together what had happened minute by minute that night. Surveillance footage from the hotel's hallway showed Daniel entering and leaving the suite around the time of the incident. Though the camera didn't capture the assault itself, it confirmed his presence during the crucial window. Phone records also showed messages sent between guests after the attack, with several referring to the confrontation and its aftermath. By the end of the second phase of the trial, the picture had become clearer but more painful. It was evident that one man's anger had collided with another's fragile peace, leading to irreversible loss. Both families, the Rodimers and the Tapps, sat on opposite sides of the courtroom, their faces showing the same exhaustion, regret, and disbelief. As closing arguments neared, the stakes grew higher. The prosecution demanded accountability, arguing that no fame or family loyalty could excuse violence. The defense urged the jury to see the humanity in Daniel's mistake to believe that he never intended harm. The city of Las Vegas waited for answers, watching as this case of celebrity and tragedy edged closer to its conclusion. But the story was far from over. The verdict, the confession, and the final reckoning, all of that still lay ahead. As the trial entered its final stage, the tension in the Las Vegas courtroom was thick enough to feel. The jury had listened for weeks to testimony, to experts, to conflicting stories about what really happened inside that hotel suite on October 29, 2023. The prosecution had built a case of unchecked rage. The defense had pleaded for understanding, painting the incident as a tragic mistake. Now, the truth, or at least the verdict, was within reach. In closing arguments, the prosecutor spoke firmly and without emotion. He reminded the jury of the photographs, the medical report, the witnesses who had watched the confrontation unfold. He described how Daniel Rodimer, a man trained for combat and control, used that same force in a setting where no fight should have existed. This was not an accident, the prosecutor said, pacing slowly before the jury. This was anger, deadly, reckless, and deliberate. He spoke of Christopher Tapp, the victim who had already suffered a lifetime of injustice, and how fate had cruelly betrayed him once more. He lost 20 years of freedom to a system that failed him. And when he finally began living again, another man's temper took everything away. The room fell silent. Then it was the defense's turn. Daniel's attorney approached the jury with a softer tone, his voice carrying the weight of regret. He described Daniel as a father first, a man protecting his family in a moment of fear and confusion. He did not go to that party to fight, he said. He went to celebrate with his family. He believed someone had given his stepdaughter something dangerous. He acted without thinking, not with hatred, but with panic. The defense argued for leniency, for understanding that this was not premeditated murder, but a spontaneous act of emotion that ended in tragedy. As the lawyers finished, Daniel Rodimer stood to address the court for the first time. His voice trembled slightly as he turned toward Christopher Tapp's family. "There are no words that can make this right," he said quietly. "I wish I could take back that moment every single day. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I thought I was protecting my family, but instead I destroyed two." The courtroom was still. Tapp's sister sat in tears, clutching a photo of her brother. After deliberations that lasted nearly 2 days, the jury returned with its decision. The room filled with tension as the foreperson stood to speak. Daniel Rodimer was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, not premeditated murder, but a crime acknowledging his direct responsibility for Tapp's death. The charge carried significant prison time, and while some in the courtroom gasped in relief that it wasn't a full murder conviction, others wept at the word guilty. Justice, at least in the eyes of the court, had been served. When the judge delivered sentencing a few weeks later, he spoke directly to Daniel. "Mr. Rodimer, you were a man admired for your strength and discipline. But on that night, you allowed anger to take command. Your actions took a man's life and shattered multiple families. Fame and power do not place anyone above the law." The judge then sentenced him to between 10 and 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum term. Daniel nodded silently, tears forming in his eyes. His wife sat in the front row, pale and motionless. As officers approached to escort him from the courtroom, he paused one last time to glance back at the Tapp family. No words were exchanged, but the look was one of remorse, an unspoken acknowledgement of the irreversible damage done. Outside the courthouse, news crews lined the steps. The once confident ex-wrestler and politician was now a convicted felon, his public life in ruins. Reporters called out questions. "Do you regret what happened? Will you appeal?" Daniel didn't respond. His lawyer briefly told the press that his client had accepted responsibility and that they would respect the court's decision. The story quickly spread across the country, drawing reactions of shock, disappointment, and sorrow. For Christopher Tapp's family, the verdict brought a measure of peace, though not closure. They spoke briefly to the media, saying they were grateful that justice had been done, but that nothing could bring Chris back. He deserved to live, his sister said. He deserved to enjoy the freedom he waited so long for. In the months that followed, the noise surrounding the case slowly faded. The bright lights of Las Vegas moved on to new headlines. But for the families involved, the pain lingered. Daniel Rodimer began serving his sentence quietly, away from cameras, away from the spotlight that had once defined him. Those who knew him said he spent much of his time reflecting, writing letters to his children, and expressing remorse for the choices that destroyed so many lives. The story of Daniel Rodimer and Christopher Tapp remains a haunting reminder of how quickly lives can change. One moment of anger, one lapse in judgment, can erase decades of achievement. In Las Vegas, a city built on illusion and image, this tragedy exposed something painfully real, that behind fame and success, there are always human flaws. Two men crossed paths by chance that October night, one seeking joy, the other trying to protect his family. Neither could have imagined how it would end. And though justice was done, the shadow of that night will never truly fade.